bankruptcy and diligence, etc., decrees for removing from heritable property, Scotland Amendment Order 2025, and the Scottish Secure Tenancies Proceedings for Possession, Form of Notice, Amendment Regulations 2025. So I welcome to the meeting Mary McCallan, Cabinet Secretary for Housing, and I also welcome her officials from the Scottish Government, Pauline Bryce, Housing Policy Manager, Yvette Shepherd, Head of Rented Sector Unit, and Craig McGuffey, Solicitor for the Scottish Government. So thank you very much for joining us today. And following this evidence session, the committee will be invited in the upcoming agenda item to consider a motion to approve the affirmative instrument. I remind everyone that Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate if there is one that follows. So I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to make some opening remarks on all 4 SSIs. Thank you.
And good morning to the committee. Thank you for the invitation to attend today to give evidence on the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Act 2021, consequential and supplementary amendments, Regulations 2026, which, as you have said, are accompanied by 3 negative instruments which you have put on the record. Domestic abuse is a leading cause of women's homelessness in Scotland. I believe that nobody should have to choose between having a home and having their safety, and this package of SSIs will bring new powers into force to protect victims of domestic abuse and hold perpetrators to account. Part 2 of the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Act 2021 provides social landlords with a new ground to apply to the court for an order which, if it's granted, will enable the landlord to transfer a tenancy to a victim of domestic abuse. This will allow landlords, rather than the victims themselves, to take action in court to transfer the tenancy. In bringing forward these regulations, we've worked with stakeholders, including social landlords and, crucially, the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, to develop a package of secondary legislation which is required to implement these provisions. The package of secondary legislation makes consequential changes to existing legislation. It also prescribes new statutory notice forms to allow the measures of Part 2 to operate. And in particular, the regulations provide that, 1, only the abusive tenant can be removed from the property where a court order on the new ground is granted, and not the victim or the victim's family, unless that family member is specifically named on the court order. Only the abusive tenant will be given notice to remove themselves and their belongings from the property, unless anyone else is specifically named in the order. The tenant and any qualifying occupier must be notified that the landlord is seeking to raise court action on domestic abuse grounds and provided with information on what this will mean for them. And the victim is always notified that the landlord intends to raise court proceedings on the new domestic abuse ground, including where the victim has had to flee the property. These changes are essential so that the victim and any members of the victim's family cannot be moved from the property, along with the abuser, and so that all parties understand what court action will mean for them, including, of course, the victim's right to play a part in any court action that may arise. Implementation of Part 2 of the 2021 Act has been very complex. It has required consequential changes to legislation, which have been moving through there, and this has included changes to court orders and issues around data sharing between relevant bodies, all of which are both essential but complicated. We have also begun progressing a number of other important measures to strengthen protection against homelessness for domestic abuse victim survivors, not least the creation of a national fund to leave, in which we put £1.5 million behind that in this financial year and have allocated £2 million for the following financial year. We have also worked closely with the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service on the development of appropriate court rules and changes to court forms, and the commencement date of the 1st of August, which we're proposing here, provides that sufficiency of time to be ready. And of course, detailed statutory guidance for social landlords on the use of the new provisions has also been produced, a draft shared with key stakeholders for their views, and that will be updated accordingly. In summary, this package of regulations will allow social landlords to take action on behalf of victims, removing a significant barrier that has forced too many people to flee their homes to escape abuse, Now, the perpetrator can be made to leave, not the victim. This is an important step in our commitment to continuing to tackle domestic abuse and to supporting those who are affected by it to rebuild their lives.
Okay, thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary will now move on to questions, and our questions will be directed to you, but you are, of course, welcome to invite any official to respond should you wish to do so. So can I just ask the committee, Claire, do you have a question to the Cabinet Secretary?
Yes, thank you,
Morning.
Convener. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I do welcome the regulations that are being brought forward. Can I just for some questions of clarity, so you mentioned the guidance that's been prepared, just to have an idea of when that's prepared. Will it be in advance of the, I think the 1st of August was the introduction of the regulations. The other question was around data sharing. So you spoke about speaking to the Crown Procurator Fiscal Service and local authorities, I think, but I suppose Women's Aid, where do those kind of organisations come in terms of awareness raising that the regulations were there and they can be enforced? And just so I understand, when what would be the grounds for eviction for the person who's been made to leave? Because typically it would be, the kind of set standards of what eviction could be enacted on. Would it require an offence to have been committed, or kind of what are the grounds for eviction of that individual? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll move through them, Ms Baker, and bring in my officials where I need to. So the first question on the statutory guidance. So that's being, it's been developed alongside stakeholders. It will be revised to reflect their comments now, and it will be published in spring. And supporting, so this will support social landlords to be ready for that go-live date of 1 August 2026. So all in order, all underway, with sufficient time for stakeholders' views to have been built in, and it will be ready in time for the regulations being enforced. In respect of your second question on which stakeholders we've engaged with, I think I was keen to highlight the Courts and Tribunal Service because that speaks to the complexity of getting these regulations in a position to be enforced. But of course, organisations like Women's Aid are absolutely vital to the development of this work. In fact, I just found in my notes here a quote from Marcia Scott, the Chief Executive of Scottish Women's Aid, who said, "Not all women can stay in their homes safely, which is why refuge provision is so important. But for the many that could, this regulatory change will bring much needed reform." So I have fairly frequent dialogue with Scottish Women's Aid on this, on the Fund to Leave in particular, and I'll continue to do that because their assistance in helping women navigate this will be very important. And on your third question, which was about grounds, I think what I will do is probably hand over to Craig, our solicitor, who can talk us through that.
So I think the new ground that's been introduced into the 2001 Housing Act, is ground 15A, enables a social landlord to seek the termination of a joint tenant's interest in the tenancy or the recovery of the possession of the property if the abuser is the sole tenant. And that ground applies where the tenant or one of the joint tenants has engaged in behaviour which is abusive of a person who is a partner or ex-partner of that tenant. And the house has to be that person's sole or principal home. So if there's any domestic abuse in the property, there's no standard that has to be hit. It just says abuse. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have to be a conviction. It could be a course of conduct that falls short of criminal behaviour. It's still enough for a social landlord to seek eviction.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
We've got a few other questions from Elena Whittam and Jeremy Balfour, so I'll invite Elena in. Thank you.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. As a former Women's Aid worker, I'm absolutely delighted that we're having this discussion this morning, and hopefully we're going to agree that these are accepted. I do have questions following on from Claire Baker's questions, just round about. We know that when women do leave, it's the most dangerous time for a woman who is experiencing domestic abuse, and equally I would worry, as Marcia Scott had set out as well, that this also would present a dangerous period for women, and I think the guidance is going to be critical in that respect. So I guess I'm wondering about how we ensure that the support organisations, but also the social landlord, are really aware of just the complexity surrounding it, because if they seek to raise an action that perhaps the woman herself, or the person experiencing domestic abuse, is not quite comfortable with. I'm just, I have a little bit of concern round about that, and I guess it's just to make sure that that's been looked at, to ensure that we are really thinking through all of the possibilities of what could happen during such a difficult time.
Yeah, I really welcome that question, Ms Whittam. I think that the danger and the difficulty that women face when they are being subjected to abuse makes all of this so much more complicated and sensitive, and requires really careful thought, as you're encouraging us to take, because whilst this is a really important step forward for, as I've said, allowing victim survivor to stay in her home and to have a perpetrator removed, it ultimately does rely on that woman having felt able to seek to use this new administrative process. And of course, we know that if you're being subject to abuse, you're not always in a position to do that, to advocate for yourself, etc. That's why the guidance that we will are producing in line with stakeholders is going to be so critical. And it's why I think what Craig was speaking to there about evidence of abuse is really important, and the breadth with which we've characterised that. So we're not talking here about court orders. You don't require information from Police Scotland, although all of that will help to constitute grounds for this new form of charge to be used. But it can be, there's a spectrum of what can constitute evidence of abuse. And we will encourage, through the guidance and through the work that we do with stakeholders, awareness of that, and I suppose a gendered and victim-centred approach to understanding how this is going to work.
I suppose one of the big worries that I do have is in terms of ensuring that the victim survivor is in the driving seat as much as possible. So I would caution against, although I worked previously with social landlords on this policy area, them taking that driver's seat, where they really need to make sure that that is done in conjunction with what that victim survivor is looking at, as opposed to being done to them, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does, and that's the approach that we'll be seeking to foster through the guidance.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now going to invite Jeremy in. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and to your team. I wonder if I can just ask two questions again. I absolutely welcome these, but I just want clarification on a couple of issues. Is there any evidence in your discussions with social landlords that they might be less willing to rent accommodation to couples with a history of this, if they do any checks? Because you don't want people to be penalised in getting social housing. So I'm just wondering if there are any unforeseen circumstances around that. I suppose, just going back to what we discussed previously, I suppose just looking at it from the other side, I'm just a wee bit interested to get what evidence would be required, because you will get, on very exceptional cases, malicious claims made by a man to a woman, woman to a man, and I'm just wondering what burden of proof is there. You said, I appreciate it's not a court order, but if I simply make a claim against my wife of domestic abuse, is that enough? Or what safeguard is there for people who are unrightly accused of doing something?
Thank you very much. So on the first question, Mr Balfour, I'm not concerned that this will create a freezing effect against a landlord's willingness to rent to couples, families. Domestic abuse can arise in almost any situation that you could imagine in a domestic arrangement, and therefore I think, whilst it's absolutely vital that we work with landlords to have them understand the existence of abuse and its nature, I'm not concerned that doing that will have any kind of effect on who they do and do not let to, and lettings should always be done on the basis of housing need in any case. On your second question about the grounds, I mean, I will come to Craig again just about the question of burden of proof, but this is deliberately broad. And it's deliberately broad because I think of what Ms Whittam was referring to about the difficulties that mainly women, although not always women, but for the vast majority of cases it will be women who are suffering the abuse. I wouldn't be comfortable setting a very high burden of proof, for example, requiring a court order or police information, I think that it's right that this is framed broadly. As I say, the guidance will flesh this out, but that can range from discussions, evidence, speaking to neighbours, understanding the victim themselves, testimony, right through to court provisions, should the landlord feel that that's required. So deliberately broad, but Craig, I don't know if there's anything you would want to add to that, about maybe from the landlord's perspective as well.
I think it's probably important to remember that these are not criminal proceedings, so they're civil proceedings, so the court has to be satisfied in the balance of probabilities. Has there been abusive behaviour? And abusive behaviour can be, it's defined, we're commencing section 2 of the Act only for the purposes of part 2 to bring in the definitions of abusive behaviour. So abusive behaviour is in section 2 of the Act is defined as behaviour where a reasonable person would consider that the behaviour is likely to cause the victim survivor to suffer physical or psychological harm, and physical or psychological harm can include fear or distress. So there's no need for a criminal conviction. It could be evidence taken from witness statements. It could be criminal proceedings. It could be a charge, and there is no restriction on the sorts of evidence that a social landlord could present to the court. It's not a criminal standard of proof.
I think that's really helpful. If I just come up more, I mean, obviously, it's putting quite a lot of responsibility onto the social landlord. What training are you planning to give over the next 6 months to August to help social landlords? Because clearly they will have to come to a view on this, and that, for many people, they may have experience in that, for others they won't. So I'm just wondering, what training would you expect social landlords to have before August, and when do we expect to see the guideline or guidance in regard to this?
Thank you. So just on your last question first, as I said to Ms Baker, the guidance has been under development. It has been shared with stakeholders. We will now incorporate feedback, publish in spring, and have it be ready for the regulations coming into force in August. Look, I think there's a very legitimate question here, and it's one that Scottish Women's Aid raised with me. Ms Whittam's alluding to it. It's the training and the understanding and the ability to navigate the complexities of domestic abuse in all its forms. And there's work to be done in that regard. And of course, we're dealing with a whole lot of social landlords, some of whom have capacity for training and undertaking really close and intensive work, others who won't. So I think through a combination of the guidance that we're developing on these rules specifically, but also the provision that was made in the Housing Act of 2025 for domestic abuse policies to be developed and implemented, will also be a train of work which will allow us to make sure that a really close understanding of the nature of this issue is embedded and is being understood through all social landlords who will navigate this.
Thank you, Rita.
Okay. Can I just ask if there's any further questions? No? Okay, I'm moving on to agenda item 3 is the formal consideration of motion S6M 20309 that the Social Justice and Social Security Committee recommends that the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Act 2021 consequential and supplementary amendments Regulations 2026 draft be approved. I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move the motion. Thanks.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move the motion and would simply ask that the committee consider it favourably as a significant step forward in protecting the housing rights of victim survivors of domestic abuse and their families.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to invite any contributions from members. Okay. I'm now going to invite the Cabinet Secretary either to sum up or if you want to add any further comments.
Nothing further to add, Convener. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So the question is that motion S6M 20309 in the name of Mary McCallan be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Okay. My apologies, sir. So, thank you. Are members content to delegate responsibility to me to approve a short factual report to the Parliament on the affirmative instrument? Okay, thank you. Our next agenda item is the consideration of 4 negative Scottish statutory instruments, 3 of which were referred to in evidence under item 2. I'll go through each SSI in turn to allow for members to make any comments on the instruments. Do members have any comments on the removing from heritable property form of charge amendment Scotland Regulations 2025? Okay. Do members have any comments on the bankruptcy and diligence, etc., decrees for removing from Heritable Property Scotland Amendment Order 2025? Do members have any comments on the Scottish Secure Tenancies Proceedings for Possession Form of Notice Amendment Regulations 2025? And finally, do members have any comments on the Social Security Residence in an EEA State of Switzerland Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulations 2025? Okay. I invite the committee to agree that it does not wish to make any further recommendations in relation to these instruments. Are members content to note the instruments? Okay, thank you. So that concludes today's consideration of secondary legislation. I want to thank the Cabinet Secretary and her officials for attending today's meeting, and we will have a short suspension to allow for a change of witnesses. Thank you. Our next item of business is our evidence session with the Scottish Fiscal Commission. And I very much welcome to the meeting Professor Graham Roy, welcome back, Chair of the Commission, and Justine Riccomini, Commissioner, Michael Davidson, Head of Social Security and Devolved Taxes. So thank you very much for joining us today. I'm now going to invite Professor Roy to make some brief opening remarks. Thank you.
Great. Good morning, committee, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak with you this morning, convener, about our latest fiscal and economic forecasts that we published alongside the Scottish budget. And I'll give you some key highlights from our report, and particularly how they relate to our social security forecast. But first of all, our publication comes at a time of ongoing economic uncertainty, and this has been a theme in our previous reports, and it contributes to our latest assessment of the outlook. And overall, we forecast the Scottish economy the outlook is broadly similar to what we said last December, with a small downward revision to growth next year from 1.5% to 1.3%. The reason why that is really important is that weak growth in the economy continues to feed through to a weak outlook for living standards. We forecast real disposable income per head, so a broad measure of living standards in Scotland, to grow only by an average of 0.4% each year over the medium term. And that's in line with trends seen since the financial crisis, but that's significantly slower than the 3% average improvement in living standards in the pre-crisis period. The Scottish Government is balancing funding across the spending review using borrowing, the Scotland Reserve, Crown Estate revenues and the transfer of some funding from resource to capital. Despite all of that, the funding position remains tight. And if we just look at resource spending, that's set to grow by an average of 1.1% after adjusting for inflation over each of the next 5 years. Within that, the spending review shows our health and social security spending will see the largest real terms increases, but resource funding to local government is falling as a share of the budget over the spending review. We forecast social security spending of £7.4 billion next year. That's £66 million lower than our December 2024 forecast. The largest change is a decrease in our forecast for disability and carer payments. This decrease is partially offset by higher inflation and an increase in planned spending on the pension age winter heating payment as a result of the Scottish Government policy change in June 2025. We've reduced our spending forecast for adult disability payment because there have been fewer approved applications and more people exiting the payment than we expected back in December 2024. We still expect the number of people receiving adult disability payment and spending on it to exceed what would have occurred had the personal independence payment remained in Scotland. The latest data suggests the difference is narrower than our previous forecasts. So, since June last year, the difference between our forecast and spending in social security and the block grant adjustment funding has narrowed from £2 billion to £1.2 billion in the final year of our forecasts. Interestingly, this is largely because of UK government changes, with the reversal of the planned restrictions to PIP eligibility increasing BGA funding relative to planned, and then on top of that, the removal of the two-child limit in universal credit, and then the cancelling of the Scottish Government two-child limit payment reduces spending here. Compared to our forecast from December 2024 and June 2025, the pressure on the budget from social security spending is therefore reduced, but there are risks to that assessment that we set out. First, future policy changes by the Scottish and UK governments could lead to further movements. In the next month or so, the Scottish Government is expected to respond to the recommendations of the independent review of adult disability payment. If this changes policy, it could change spending too. The UK Government is undertaking the TIMS review of PIP, expected to report in the autumn. Similarly, any policy changes that affect spending in England and Wales would have a knock-on effect to block grant adjustment funding for the Scottish Government. And finally, there's underlying uncertainty in social security forecasts, which I'm sure we've discussed previously, so I'm sure we'll discuss today as well. We are seeing a bit more of a stable picture emerging within the main disability payments in operation that Scottish Social Security Scotland has established, but there are some uncertainties remain, particularly around areas like authorisation rates and award review outcomes. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much, Professor Roy. I'm now going to head into questions and I'm going to invite Claire Baker. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. You've kind of started to lay out the reasons why we've seen a change in the forecast in terms of social security predicted spend, which has gone from 2.1 billion to 1.2 billion. It's quite a dramatic decrease, and you've outlined that's largely been changes at a UK government level. I don't know if there's anything more you want to say about that, but also when the forecasts, so you said there are still risks within that. There's a review of ADP in Scotland, and there's also possibly reviews of PIP in the UK. So when would another forecast become? How is it at the budget you do the forecast, or because I suppose when it was 2.1, everybody seemed quite confident it was 2.1, and a lot of the discussion was around Scotland's social security budget is increasing at quite a fast rate. Yeah. So where do we take that debate now? Do you still have concerns that 1.2, it's half what it was, can we all relax, or is 1.2 still something to be paying attention to and thinking, do we need to think about our sustainability?
Yeah, okay. I mean, maybe what I'll maybe say some high-level comments, and just you might want to come in on specifics of the number. So I think the movements that we've seen from the 2 billion down to the 1.2 are really significant variations. I think what's interesting about this is that this just shows you the nature of the framework that we have is such that it doesn't just matter what happens in Scotland, it's what happens in the UK as well. So if you take that movement down from the 2 billion to the 1.2 billion, there's some adjustments we've made to our forecasts, but the biggest changes have come for about £500 million change in the funding associated with the planned PIP restrictions to then being offset and reversed, and then the plan changes to the two-child limit on universal credit, which is about another 0.2 billion. So I think that's one of the natures, the risks with this framework, where the policy changes, not just in Scotland, but policy changes in the UK can have quite a significant impact on the net position that flows through. In terms of the technical bit about when we'll do our next forecast, so yes, we do forecasts at the time of the budget, fiscal events. So that would typically be at the budget, and then the medium-term financial strategy, which usually would be in the spring, but with the election, it's probably likely to be delayed. But Justine, I don't know if you want to come in on any of the specific numbers.
Yeah, I think, thank you. I think that essentially Graham covered off about the sort of the narrowing, but actually if you look at page 87 of our report at 5.37 and 5.38, in the forecast in December 2024, the social security spending exceeded BGA funding by 1.5 billion in up to 29-30, but then between December 24 and June 25, that difference widened right out to 2 billion. And now what we're saying is it's back down to 1.2. And that really just establishes how exposed the Scottish funding position is in terms of UK government policy changes. So we saw that 0.4 billion was taken out of the BGAs in 29-30 for changes to PIP that the UK government announced in March 2025. But those changes have since been abandoned, so obviously we've changed our forecast accordingly, and we've just seen nearly 0.5 billion added back in. And we've also seen how some non-policy changes to OBR and SFC forecasts can actually change that overall net position as well. So if we look at page 88 of our forecast, we've worked it out that it's now sort of more in the Scottish budget's favour than it was before. So in paragraph 5.38 of the report, we actually talk about how the downward revision to our forecast and an upwards revision by the Office of Budget Responsibility actually narrow that gap. But obviously that's an example of where both the forecasts have moved in a direction that favours the Scottish budget at the moment. So in future, for example, if we saw SFC forecasts revised upwards and OBRs revised downwards, then that could actually see that net position widen back out again. So that gives you might give you a flavour, hopefully, of the uncertainty of the position, because it's a moving feast, really. So yeah, that's all I've got to say on that at the moment.
Yeah, it's probably been quite a good lesson in forecasting for MSPs, because it has shifted significantly and there's justification for that, but it does change some of the nature, or it's a potential change some of the nature of the debate. But to get a better understanding of the 1.2 billion gap within the Scottish budget and within predictions over the next few years, do you think that's a sustainable gap or a manageable gap, or is that something that can be adjusted within existing budgets, or does it present a challenge still for the Scottish Government in terms of financing?
So ultimately, the decision, because the government has to balance the budget, if there's a difference between the funding for the equivalent payments in the rest of the UK and how much the Scottish Government choose to spend there and choose to introduce new payments such as Scottish Child Payment, that's just then becomes a decision of balancing priorities for the Scottish budget. So I think it's perhaps sometimes unhelpful when we have conversations about it's unsustainable or it's not, it's not affordable. Everything is affordable in the sense that the government have to balance the budget. It's just the relative priorities, and it's the government's priority that they're going to spend additional spending relative to funding in the area of social security. The downside or the flip side of that means that you then have to find that from other sources, either from taxation or from trimming other areas of public services. And that is then just a choice for the government about the relative prioritisation.
Mm-hmm. And then you talked about the difference between ADP spend and PIP BGA spend and the narrowing there. And I think other members might have some questions around this. I think you mentioned the way in which ADP, I think more people have come off the payment, and I think you said there's been fewer applications. Is that the reason for the narrowing, or is there something else going on there in terms of narrowing?
Yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll take that one if that's all right. So essentially, first of all, if we look at the maths, the OBR's forecast in personal independence payment spending is slightly higher than our forecast in 25-26 on a per capita basis, but that actually represents sort of relatively small differences, really. Mm-hmm. The OBR's PIP forecast has grown by 11%, but after when you've adjusted for like population differences and things, that means that the corresponding block grant adjustment grows by 10%, and then our Scottish Fiscal Commission forecast then grows by 8%. So the forecasts have been done at slightly different times. As we say, there's all these moving parts. So forecasts get done at slightly different times with different data sets and assumptions. So it's not really necessarily a good idea to just look at one single year on its own. You've got to kind of look across the piece. We've got similar issues, if it's any consolation, by looking at income tax, which is on a larger scale, where we often talk about slightly different earnings assumptions, timings and reconciliations, but we have to do it over a wider period of years. So for the next year of 26-7, we can see what we think is an opposite effect, with the forecast growing slightly faster, and then the net position widens back out. So over the whole forecast period, the growth in spending and the block grant adjustment are very similar relative to the 24-25 starting point, which is when we've got outturns. So we think that the gap is generally kind of less over the forecast period than it was before, which is good news, but we need to look across years, which is sort of what we've said on pages 81 and 82 of the report. And we just need to look at, over that time, what the trends are in authorisation rates and exits and reviews information coming through.
And is it still, so I have one more question, Convener. We have a SPICE paper, on page 2, table 1, is that from the Scottish Fiscal Commission, that chart? I don't think it says where it's from. But anyway, the chart says that it would still be adult disability payment is the one that's growing at the fastest rate. The chart says 70%, but like the 5 family payments are only growing at 15%, and a lot of our debate is around child poverty. But we see, the payments, that's going at a much slower rate than ADP. Is that a trend you would expect to see continue? Is that
Yeah, so on the trend about the total spend on disabilities, that's largely trends that are driven across the UK. So it's similar trends across the UK about the really sharp inflow we've seen in recent times in people, both adults and children, moving into disability payments. So some of the other payments are more stable in terms of their growth because the caseload is stable. So if you take, for example, if you know the classic one in that would be the Scottish Child Payment, is that you know we pretty much know the population of children in Scotland who are entitled to that, and there'll be variations around that relative to changes in the economy, but it's likely to be relatively stable as a take-up, as an overall proportion of the population. Whereas what we're seeing in the disability payments is this significant continued inflow across the UK into these payments, and that's the reason why that one is driving up so significantly, and age as well. So the correlation between disability and age is a factor in that as well.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much, Claire. I'm now going to invite Alexander Stewart in. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Professor Roy, in your opening statement, you touched on the forecasts and the observations and some of the risks that we face, and it would be quite good to maybe try to work on some of that now. So can I ask about the observations and to what extent social security net positions change between forecasts? And then what do these actually mean, the forecasts mean, and the level of risk that we have to endure the spending process for the actual budget, the Scottish budget as a whole, because that does have an influence on what can and where we can go with that. So it would be good to get a clarity from the observations you have.
Yes, okay. So I'll maybe go first, and then Justine, you might want to come in as well. So on the general point, I think the point of just picking on the question, the answer to Ms Baker is that essentially the difference between the funding, the equivalent funding, and then the payments in Scotland, we think will be about 1.1 billion next year. That will rise to about 1.2 billion over the forecast horizon. And that then is money, that is then resource that has to be found elsewhere from within the budget or through higher taxation. So the risk is about, I think, is about how much that moves based on the current spending plans. On the one hand, and so if we unpick what the risks are, on the one hand, the risks around, or some of the risks we've spoken about before, where these are new payments, they're coming in for the first time, there's uncertainty about how they'll be delivered, what take-up will be, etc. I think we've got more confidence and certainty around that. So I use the example of the Scottish Child Payment as one now, where we're now pretty confident about take-up, we're pretty confident about the number of children in Scotland, so that's a relatively stable forecast. On some of the other ones, though, on disability payments, for example, we're seeing this significant inflow across the UK of people into disability payments. We know some of the reasons for that, linked to age, but I don't think we fully, and it's not just us, I don't think we fully understand what are the factors and what are the trends that will continue that are leading to, that are leading to these observations we've had around disability. And that is a risk, because if they continue or they escalate, that could be more funding. Clearly, if they ease back, then that would potentially be less spending commitments there. So then I think the final piece in all of this is the bit that we're discussing there, is that the impact on the budget, so the net impact on the budget, depends upon policy choices by the Scottish Government, but also by the UK Government. So if the Scottish Government chooses to, in the future, to reform adult disability payments, to increase average payments, for example, or to expand the coverage, that would then be a spending commitment that would need to be paid for. Similarly, if the UK Government reform some payments in the UK, maybe doing the same thing, that would lead to additional funding. So that's where the risks can potentially move. And the bolder or the bigger these policy reforms, the potential, the bigger the effects on the budget.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that as well. I think in terms of sort of the risks that we're looking at, there are, we're seeing sort of in terms of, like, for example, forecasting the disability caseload. We've seen, I think Graham just mentioned actually, there is first and foremost an upward pressure from an ageing population in Scotland. So that comes with its own problems for those people. And then the other thing that we're seeing across the UK generally is, due to a number of different surveys that have taken place anyway, is the rising prevalence of disability for mental and behavioural conditions. So that also adds to the risk profile. And there are also reports of cost of living pressures, and particularly in 2022 there was a rise in inflation that was quite significant. So that might have led to more people to claim. We're not necessarily aware of the absolute detail. We just know what the numbers are coming in of the rising claims. So there might also be other factors associated with the overall benefits system there as well, which might push people towards claiming for disability or particular health-related problems. So I think we know that the OBR actually discussed this matter with the Finance Committee as well earlier this month, where I think it was noted that people who are just on the unemployment-related benefits are subject to some sanctions, conditionality, such as benefit cap, whereas health-related or disability benefits in particular are at higher rates, and they're exempt from benefit caps, so that can also affect the numbers. And then finally, I think there might be some interactions there as well with some rising numbers and spending for children with special educational needs as well.
Okay, thank you. And the whole area of when we're talking about the uncertainty, maybe get a feeling of from you, what are the key areas of uncertainty in the current forecast of the difference between the block grant adjustment and social security spending itself?
So I think the one is the policy changes. So we are waiting, as I mentioned, in the opening remarks, waiting on the TIMS review. That could have an impact. That would be essentially changing the level of BGA funding, which would then have a potential impact on the net position. And similarly, waiting on the Scottish Government's response to the ADP review. So they're probably known unknowns in that regard, if I can use that phrase. I think then on the broader uncertainty, I think particularly around the disability things, is there's two parts to that. One is the overall trends in health and how sustained these are going to be, and there's a lot of studies looking into that and what are the effects that are causing that. Within our own forecast, there's a couple of things that we highlight which are quite interesting. One of these is the authorisation rate. So we've seen kind of relatively high applications holding up, but we've got a chart on, it's figure 5.3 in our report, where back in 2023, the authorisation rate was about 50%. So essentially 1 in 2 people applying for adult disability payment were being successful. In the most recent data that we have for July, that's down to 35%. And that's lower than PIP, actually. So it's a lower success rate for adult disability payment than PIP. Now, this is an area where I still think the new payments are bedding down. So that's an area where we'll be interested to see. We don't think it will keep falling. We think it will start to level off and may rise again. But that is an area where we don't know. And we just need a bit more time to see the data to get a bit more stability.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm now going to invite Elena Whitman. Thanks.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning. A few of my questions have already actually been answered and touched upon. I think that's just the nature of how our questioning goes. But just if I could press a little bit more around about the caseloads that we do see rising right across the UK. And we do know that in February there's due to be a report published by the Office of the Chief Social Policy Advisor that's going to try and look back over the last decade and actually try and unpick and understand what these trends are. Well, actually more than a decade, since 2010. And I guess it's difficult to kind of try and separate out speculation versus those hard causal linkages that we're really trying to look for. But I wonder if there's any way to speak a little bit more to that. We know about as you've set out, the ageing population and the issues in regards to mental health, etc. But I guess it makes it really difficult for us as a committee and as a parliament, and indeed for the government, to try and set policy and strategy going forward when it really looks uncertain. And you just touched as well on the differences between the authorisation rates, and we know that that's maybe had an influence in that position between ADP and PIP. And again, that really makes it a bit difficult for us to try and unpick everything behind it. So, those are the kind of questions that I had. You've already kind of touched on them a little bit, but anything else you could offer would be really helpful.
Yeah.
I can.
I mean, maybe say a general couple of comments, and and then I'll bring Michael on the data. So I think you're right, and I think in some ways, and in many ways, we kind of share the kind of the challenges in that in terms of our ability to forecast and being understand what is driving the trends is really important. What we see is the data that's flowing through and where that can potentially have an impact. So the first point I'd say is on the from a fiscal point of view. Scotland is in some ways, the budget is protected in the sense that as long as these trends in Scotland and the UK are similar and are matched, then essentially the block grant funding, adjustment funding will flow through in order to maintain the similar growth in Scotland. That's not a great outcome because it just shows you that there's more people moving into these payments, which is a bad outcome for the economy and society more broadly. But from a fiscal point of view, the key for us is whether there's a relative difference between Scotland and the rest of the UK. And we do estimate there's about 35,000 more people in Scotland who are on ADP relative to what would have been under PIP, and that's just a relative differential. So even with the falling authorisation rate, in terms of what are the factors in there, I mean, I probably read the same things as you, trying to unpick and understand what's going on. I mean, age is obviously a part there that we know historically there's been a positive correlation between age and disability payments. So as the average age of the population rises, then you would expect over time those payments to increase. There's been some speculation that has actually proven not entirely always to be right. So some of the stuff around the economy impacts and people people flowing into these payments because of the cost of living. Actually, when we've looked at the data with hindsight, that's not been one of the main driving factors in there. So then I think you are into potentially more concerning reasons structurally, which is this decline in well-being, this decline in physical and mental health that is leading to a more significant sustained flow of people moving into these payments, and that is then a whole host of complexities and stuff. I mean, one thing which I do think is concerning, and maybe Michael might want to come in on this and help with some of the numbers, but the inflow into child disability payments is one that we've consistently under forecast in terms of caseloads. We've consistently underestimated the inflow of children flowing into CDP. And the concern that we would have from that would be is that does that then lead to a constant flow through? And what is that telling us more broadly about the experience of young people and children to see these increases coming through? So I know that's a very long answer, which is to say I share the kind of frustrations, or at least the hope that we get a bit more clarity about some of the drivers in that over time.
Just perhaps before you bring Michael in, just in terms of that increase in the numbers in child disability payment, and that flow through perhaps into adult disability payment for those individuals. Do we have any understanding, maybe it's not for yourselves to maybe answer this question, but just as you said, I was thinking, do we have any understanding whether that itself is related to mental health issues or neurodevelopmental issues, or versus any physical health issues? Do we understand any of that?
Yes. So I don't know, Michael, if you want to come in on that, but...
happy to. Yeah, I think the transition from children into adult, I've got some figures there. So I think around 500, we think, based on the latest data, it's around 500 per month children sort of then move on to adult disability payment at around the age of 18. And I think most young people leaving CDP when they apply at age 18, or coming up to 18, I think the success rate's around 75% for those moving in. So it's a lot higher than the new claims that we've seen, which is around 30, which is understandable because they've sort of previously been in the system. And I don't have figures on the conditions for child disability payment, but it is very much more on the the rise in that caseload has very much more been around the mental and behavioural conditions rather than physical conditions. And as Justine mentioned, it links into what you can see in some of the data from schools as well around the volume of children with additional support needs. So yeah, that's obviously, if that you're building up, if there's a sort of cohort at younger ages, and then we see that then aging into the adults, so we've sort of got then a higher proportion of younger adults within the adult disability payment caseload, and we know that they don't, the exit rates are very low. So, you know, the concerns obviously that if you've got this cohort who start receiving adult disability payment at a younger age, then they continue to age through sort of for quite a long time.
Okay. It might be something to do with, you know, better diagnosis, you know, but more in detailed, in-depth assessments of children with mental or behavioural problems as well, which weren't necessarily recognised even a few years ago.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I guess the last question I have is round about our expectations about the differential between the caseloads of ADP and PIP. And obviously we've discussed already this morning about how that has narrowed a little bit, and we can see that in the figures. We did have David Wallace in front of us in an evidence session recently where, you know, we did question round about the authorisations rate, and it was not a policy decision or something that was that they were looking at proactively, but they're trying to understand what happened there too. But I take your point, Professor Roy, about the fact that you wouldn't anticipate that that would perhaps remain in that space, and it might we might start to see that change again. And again, I guess that just makes it difficult for us to, you know, to understand the changing nature of the forecasting. I don't know if you could say anything.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. I think we've spoken before when we've come to the committee. I think that in some ways we have to be patient as forecasters just to see how things bed down. So the example I gave of the Scottish Child Payment, before that came in, we didn't know what take-up rate would be. Now we've got good data points that we think that's pretty stable and that's pretty robust. So then our forecast is likely to be more stable going forward. I think on the, you know, the adult disability pay, the authorisation rate, you know, to see like an authorisation rate of 50%, so 1 in 2 people applying for ADP, and then that falling down to essentially 1 in 3, you know, authorisation rate. That's quite a shift. And the question for us is that just volatility, or is it a trend? And we just need a few more data points to know that actually this is just volatility, and it will stabilise at a rate where once these payments bed in, once everybody is into the new system, that the average authorisation rate will be relatively flat over time, and then that means we can give more confidence and certainty about those forecasts. And the similar one that we're also seeing is I think you touched on with David Muir there, is the kind of the outflows, so like the people who are having their award decreased or ended. Again, that's one where we've seen quite a volatility over the first couple of years of adult disability payment. And again, we just need to wait another few data points in order to have that uncertainty. So I share your somewhat frustration and the challenges you face in making this, you know, making decisions and scrutinising it because of the volatility, and we just need to wait for these to bed down.
Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm now going to invite Jeremy Balfour in. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner, and good morning. Good morning. I mean, I was interested in your comment just about 2 or 3 minutes ago about how it's unfortunate that more people are claiming. Oh, I haven't quoted you quite exactly right, but along that, could you, and then the comment we just heard a moment ago, is it not actually just better diagnosis? So actually, 20 years ago, there were a number of people sitting with either physical or mental disability who simply were not being diagnosed appropriately and should have been entitled to this benefit.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think you're right. I mean, I think when I'm talking about the influence, I think there's 2 parts to it. So one is better diagnosis, reduce stigma as well, that is then encouraging people to do it. We also talk about, if you look at the other data, there's survey data that asks people, like, do you have a disability? And that's much higher than the people who are actually, the proportion of people who are claiming payment. So again, that suggests there's a way to go for people who are entitled to payment to access it. I think, though, what I would also say, though, is that you do see trends, you know, across the UK, and this is a UK trend, of more people moving into disability payments or reporting a diagnosis relative to what's happened in the past. And within that, reflecting a broader set of factors, so concerns around, you know, well-being, around social media for young people, around concerns around poverty and equality, concerns about, you know, broader challenges in society, family life. There's certainly a trend in there which is in the data that hasn't historically been in the data in the past.
So arguably, both UK and Scottish Government should be tackling those social issues, and that would then, if we got those right, the ADP level would then, and other disability payments might then reduce.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess the key thing is the inflow coming in, has that essentially always been there, but what you've done is you've actually now improved the system, that the inflow is now flowing through properly. But also, I do think there's a genuine policy concern. Is there something more broadly happening in society, in the economy, with instability, with the quality of work, with in-work poverty, that is actually leading to people having a poorer quality life than they otherwise would have done? And then what can you do in interventions earlier on to essentially prevent people having to flow into payments than they otherwise would have done?
Thank you. Professor Roy, you're too young, but for those of us who are slightly older and go back to the dark ages, PIP and its predecessors were all set up to help those with disability to get into employment. It was meant to be to help the cost to do that. Is there any work done? But if we reduce people's ADP, if we took people off ADP, would that have any effect on the employment rate? And would it actually, if we took people off ADP, would they then be more unlikely to go and work and thus increase other benefits such as universal credit?
Yeah, so that's not something we've done, so it's not work that we would do to look at, you know, policy counterfactuals in that. So that's not something that we would have done. I know there is, from my kind of academic world, there's a big literature and a lot of work into how do you support and how do you ensure employability support is there for people, not just with, you know, disabilities, but also broader, whether it be poverty, inequality and the like in there, and what more can you do in there to do it. The one point I would make that I think is really interesting, and I know this committee has been interested in this in the past, is that back in the olden days, and it was very kind of you to say that, but the assumption that getting into work was the way out of poverty, you know, we know that's no longer the case. So the significant number of families that are in poverty but have somebody in the household working, and that gets into much broader questions about the quality of work, about fair work, about the living wage. So I think there's a broader issue in there just about the quality of employment as well that would add to your point about employability.
Thank you, Gavina.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to invite Marie McNair in. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Obviously, just following on there from Mr Balfour's comment, I mean, obviously, you know, at the same time, with regards to employment, you know, in claiming ADP, a lot of folk, you know, the partners are having to just do sort of part-time work. So in terms of the kind of the income that's going into that property, it's very limited, as you know. Just like my colleague, Miss Whitten there, obviously my questions are kind of covered as well. But really over a kind of very short time, there's been kind of several policy announcements that have affected your forecasts. You know, those being like winter heating and the two-child policy and the Scottish Child Payment. Do you want to say anything else, you know, on how the policy changes are affecting your forecast? I mean, obviously, you have already covered it, but is there anything you've missed out? Maybe you want to say now?
Yeah. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah. Okay. So there's sort of three main themes, really, I guess. The first one is in-year policy changes. So obviously, Scottish Government policy changes, including, you know, previous responses to things like pandemics and whatnot, you know, they affect our forecast quite considerably. And, you know, especially things like discretionary housing payments, Scottish Welfare Fund and all that kind of thing. So what usually happens there is that the spending increases above our forecast. But we've had a big reduction for the 2024 year due to Scottish Government aligning with UK decisions around the winter fuel payment. So that's influenced the forecast as well. And then also there are other factors that we regard as being kind of outside of our own control as well. So, you know, it might be something to do with a change of direction or a new idea or a new policy coming in. And it might not be surprising to other people, but we nevertheless have to amend our own policies. And if the Scottish Government decides to give additional money to local authorities, then, you know, it's not really demand-led spending per se. So that can be done kind of on a one-off basis in a particular year. So they might show up in terms of our forecasting as a forecast error, even though it wasn't down to us originally. Disability payments are the other big chunk that we've discussed already as well. So they can be sort of outside of our control to some extent, in that they are demand-led, but they're also, it depends on the amount of people that get through the system and receive the payments. So we do rely on Social Security Scotland to provide us with a bulk of data about all of that. And I know that despite originally having, you know, several concerns about the data from Social Security Scotland, we do know that that is now starting to really come through, and we're seeing improvements in the data that we're getting from them all the time. So that's a good news story, really. We just want more of the same, I guess. So that would really help us with what we need. So it's been sort of quite difficult for us to predict things like spikes in demand. But as I say, over time, as we begin to see things starting to stabilise, then we'll be able to predict it in a better way. In terms of new payments, our sort of forecast errors might have been slightly larger on the new types of payments, but that's because everything's new and we have to make certain assumptions about what those payments might look like over time. And then we might actually see the reality of that on outturn and see that it's come down.
Can I just add a bit more just on the policy background, because I think the pension age winter heating payment in particular is an interesting one, because there were sort of multiple iterations. I think, hopefully I've got the dates right here, I think it was in summer 2024, winter fuel payments was restricted to households where someone was in receipt of qualifying benefit, which was essentially pension credit. And that was UK government, and then Scottish government followed that because of the reduction in funding. Then move on to, I think it was November 2024, there was then the expansion to include a £100 payment to all households that weren't included with someone with a qualifying benefit. And then move on again and that increased the costs up from about 30 million per year up to around 100 million for 25-26. And then in the summer, just gone, winter fuel payment was expanded by the UK government, so that then it would go to all households at the previous payment rates, but then be clawed back from those with an income over 35,000. And then the Scottish Government also followed that approach. So then you have a forecast going back up now to sort of 195 million now for 26-27. So you can see that's in quite a short space of time, quite a lot of movement just for one, what we might say was previously quite a stable and sort of manageable area of forecasting.
Thank you. It's good to hear about...
And sorry, before you move on, Marie, I think Claire wanted to just come in on that line of question.
Yeah, thank you. It's kind of linked to what Michael was speaking about. So the recovery, the 35,000 clawback, we don't yet know how many people are engaged in that. And because the Scottish Government are also linking the payment to inflation, you would expect more people to reach the 35 sooner than if it wasn't linked to inflation? That would make sense?
Not the clawback side of it. So the inflation linking, our understanding is that the 35,000 limit will isn't going to be increased with inflation. So yeah, that means
but the
that
payment,
more people.
sorry, I meant the payment, what is it called, the pensioner age winter heating payment, that will increase by inflation. So more people will reach 35 sooner.
No,
Would they?
it would only be a very small. I'm
Minor.
not sure if it's taxable income either, because it'd
Right,
be
okay.
more their sort of pension income
Right.
that would affect that, and that's going to apply. But what is the effect? The effect of the uprating in Scotland does mean that there's a gap emerges between what the BGA funding that will come through from the
Will
UK
cover,
government
yeah.
and the spending.
Okay.
And I think I've got it here somewhere, just what the gap gets out to. I think it grows to around 30 million over the forecast period. So by towards the end of the 5-year forecast period, the spending on, and this is the gross spending on pension age 118 payment before you get to the clawback,
Right.
the gap gets to around 30 million. But the clawback is also an interesting thing. I guess it gets down into the technicalities of the fiscal framework, but our understanding at the moment is that HMRC will collect that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of separate. The block grant adjustment is based on the gross spending, so the spending to everyone in England and Wales before the clawback is applied, and then this, so it's sort of the full amount that the Scottish Government receives. Social Security Scotland is paying out the gross amounts to everyone, and then it's HMRC that, through the income tax system, that's clawing back the payments from households who've got income over 35,000, and then essentially the HMRC retains the clawback from Scotland and from England and Wales rather than that flowing back, because the Scottish Government's getting the block grant on gross terms rather than net terms.
Right, okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Apologies, Marie, sorry. It was just, I'm conscious that Claire is having to leave us early for another
Sure.
appointment, sorry.
Thanks for bringing it back to my line of questions, though. It's good to kind of get assurance in terms of the data. It's an issue that has been raised numerous times. And obviously, Michael, you're obviously, it's a very difficult issue in terms of planning budgets, obviously, with the UK. You know, U-turns are happening sort of every other day. Obviously, I think as well, the uncertainty of the proposed kind of PIP, you know, cuts where they sort of sit. So I think it's kind of really hard for yourself in terms of, you know, planning ahead, obviously, but there is such fluctuations in the sort of policy we've got in front of us. I wanted to ask a question, obviously, with regards to terminal illness claims. Obviously, the Scottish Government have adopted a much more humane approach to terminal illness, one that kind of pays an enhanced rate for both components. How does that impact on forecasts on disability benefits? Or are there a number of claims for terminal illness that are pretty low in sort of the grand scale?
Yeah. Do you want to come in? And
Yeah, I think when it's something that we looked at specifically in advance of the launch of adult disability payment, where we didn't have any data. It was one area where we knew there'd be a change, and we used a study from the Scottish Government that they did, it was Delphi analysis on the potential impacts. So that informed our forecast at that stage. I think it's probably fair to say, because of the scale of adult disability payment, it's not an area that we've looked at specifically because we've now got sort of the full set of adult disability payment data. So we don't sort of separate that part of the forecast out, because we see it as a relatively small part, and we pick it up in sort of our look at the overall data rather than sort of looking at that separately.
Thank you.
But it's a really good example. If I can just add, it's a really good example of one where you have a policy differential. For us, from a fiscal perspective, it's relatively small, But if you started to have policy differentials in other areas within the payment system more generally, that's where it starts to, you start to have different effects. And exactly, it's the flip of that is any reforms at the UK, perhaps to, to reduce inflows into disability payments or to restrict eligibility, that under the framework means less funding, and that means that the Scottish Government has then got decisions to either replicate that or to find that money from somewhere else.
No, absolutely. But it's good to see there's kind of fairness and dignity and respect in our policies, I've got to say. Spending on kind of mitigating the benefit cap generally below budget, the way the UK Government has chosen really to leave some families with more than 2 children capped might see more demand on the budget. Is that your kind of your findings going forward?
So it's one of the areas which is always quite, it's always one of the ones which is quite difficult to forecast, in part because the number is quite low. So I think we were forecasting about 8 million on the benefit cap in 24-25. It came in about 5 million, and a lot of that is just because the pool of potential people receiving the benefit cap are relatively small. They're obviously really vulnerable, groups of vulnerable people, etc., but they're quite small. So then there's small variations in that. Small variations in the uprating can have a potential significant impact on the ability of the people who are there. So we have done some stuff where we think that because of the mitigating of the benefit of the kind of 2-child limit and the knock-on effects to that, we've added an additional spending we think the Scottish Government will need to spend in order to account for the fact that that will have a knock-on effect to the benefit cap, and the Scottish Government will then have to essentially, if they're committed to maintaining the mitigating the benefit cap, that will be additional spending that will come in. Again, the numbers from a fiscal perspective are relatively small. Clearly, it matters a lot to the people being impacted by that, but we think it's about £8 million, which will take it up to about £15 million, but in the total of £6,000 million of the total payments is relatively small.
Thank you. Kavira, I'll leave it at that, but I might come in later on.
That's
time
fine.
allows. Thank you.
Yeah, no, perfect. Thank you. So I'm now going to invite Carol Mockin, who is joining us remotely. Thanks. Over to you, Carol. Thanks.
Appreciate that. Morning. I just want to touch a wee bit on the effect of inflation. I know in your answers to questions that has been touched on, but I suppose just to ask, to what extent do changing inflation forecasts pose a risk to the social security budget, and how do you feel the Scottish Government, handle that in terms of, their forecasting of it in terms of their overall budget for periods of time?
Yeah. Do you want to go? Yeah. Do you want to go?
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so essentially, if I just run through the kind of immediate year ahead, it's fairly low risk at the moment. Inflation as such doesn't generally pose a massive direct risk to the forecast for the immediate budget year. So that's because we normally know what the rate is, because it's set out in September of every year. In this case, it was 3.8% in September 2025. So the Scottish Government tells us in advance what they've decided to do in terms of uprating things for the coming year. So in terms of then, that's the sort of short-term issue, but then for inflation over the medium term could be mitigated by block grant adjustments in the largest sense of the word, I suppose. There's some risk over the medium term. Most benefits in England and Wales are uprated in the same way as they are here. So when that outlook changes, then there's a proportional effect in Scotland, and for the block grant adjustments. Sorry, but that then means that the Scottish Government have to find money for uprating any benefits that don't come through block grant adjustment funding. So that's where replacement Scottish benefits is now higher than the equivalent benefits that are provided by the DWP. So in terms of all of that, we expect that there's around about 85% of the cost of any change in inflation would be matched by block grant adjustments at the moment. So we've put a supplementary table in at 5.14, and we've estimated that the cumulative cost of uprating that at £1 billion in 2030 to 31, of which 0.9 billion would be covered by the effect of the uprating on block grant adjustment funding. So the other thing to bear in mind is that there's now a specific risk around the winter payments measures, as the rest of the UK equivalents have not been uprated. So Scottish Government is therefore sort of exposed to a specific risk there. It's a small risk in our terms, but nevertheless it's a risk. Both winter heating payment and the pension age winter heating payment are uprated, and the corresponding cold weather payments and winter fuel payments are not uprated in England and Wales, so that gives you a differential there. And
thank you.
Yeah, I think that's it for me. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that answer. It's helped me understand it a wee bit better, so that's great. Can I just ask, so in terms of risk, you're saying inflation is on the whole is lowish risk, but some of the demand or some of the risk might come from if in Scotland we decide to have a different policy, or the actual demand from the needs-led benefit. We need to think about that in terms of risk, or the Scottish Government need to just make sure that they're thinking about that in a way that they can manage it.
Yes, that's it perfectly. Yes, so the essentially the block grant adjustment funding essentially is designed to deliver the equivalent payments to overall payment and system to England and Wales. So if inflation is rising across the UK, and payments are uprating in the rest of the UK in terms of inflation, then that funding flows through to the Scottish budget. Where the changes come through, if you have a different policy, different ability to improve take-up rates, for example, then that is funding that has to be that is spending that has to be paid for. And the one thing I would say is that just the language of risk. When we talk about risk, we talk about it in terms of the uncertainty in our forecast. Clearly, it's not a risk in the sense that the Scottish Government have to balance it. So it's up to them to decide how they actually choose it. And I'm sure they would tell you that they don't see it as a risk. They see it as a spending and a policy choice. But for us, we talk about the risk in terms of our inability to perfectly forecast exactly what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Carol. I'm now going to invite Bob Dodison, who is also joining us online. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Convener, really interesting session. Some overlap with the questions I was going to ask as well, but the word risk, thank to Professor Roy for explaining risk in context, because risk management is what every organisation deals with as a matter of course. Can I ask about the word error also? Because when the Scottish Fiscal Commission make forecasts, and we talk about forecast errors, because the Scottish Government spends based on Scottish Fiscal Commission forecasts on taxation, they plan budgets based on forecast demand, and they're bound by those numbers. Where has the Fiscal Commission made an error in the normal understanding of the words compared to error because the rug is pulled from under your feet because there's a UK policy change or there's another external factor that could not reasonably have been seen within your forecast. So what errors did the Scottish Fiscal Commission actually make in its forecasting?
Yeah. So it's a good question, and it's the language that we use as forecasters, that we talk about error, and we mean that in the broadest sense, the difference between actually what did we say was going to happen when we published and what reality happened. And you're right, I wouldn't say it's rug being pulled from under our feet, but yeah, policy surprises, maybe we can explain it as, are things that may mean that those things are different. But we do make errors. So that would be, and typically we would judge them as being, assess them as being, for example, we might have got our judgments wrong. So a good example of that would be around the authorisation rate that we spoke about. You know, when we saw the data of 50% and we saw it coming down slightly, our judgment was it wouldn't go all the way down to just over 30%. So that's a judgment call that we make that then turns out not to be true. So sometimes there's judgment calls in there that sometimes we don't get right. There's also errors in data that we sometimes receive. So the data might be not cleaned properly or might be slightly incorrect there. There was one mechanistic error that we made, which we talked about in our forecast evaluation report, where we hadn't done the correct adjustment for people between child disability payment moving into adult disability payment. We double counted, 18-year-olds as they were moving in, and that was an error that we made in terms of that. I mean, overall, I would say our forecast errors are relatively minimal. We correct them whenever we can. And in the scheme of the overall planning for the Scottish Government that they have to do, it's relatively limited.
That's helpful, Professor. I should say I wasn't seeking to be critical of the Scottish Fiscal Commission. I was trying
you're
to
more than welcome to. Yeah.
the word error in context. I think that's important, because of course the Scottish Government sets its policies in the context of what it anticipates the next year will be like, and on forecasts set by the Scottish Fiscal Commission. When there are, if you like, shocks to projected income, and I think Justine mentioned there's an exposure to UK policy changes, and I should point out, I'm not seeking to make a constitutional point here, because the UK should get on and change its policy as it sees fit, but that can have some quite speedy, massive implications on the Scottish budget, and I think that's why we saw potential deficits increase by £1 billion plus, and then very quickly go back down again because of a UK policy turnaround. But that may not have been the case. So I suppose my substantial question is, the Fiscal Commission has to almost project without the crystal ball of these potential policy changes, and the Scottish Government has to set budgets, and it always sets balanced budgets. That's all within a context of the fiscal framework, which is supposed to be there to allow for a degree of flexibility. There's a review coming up in relation to the fiscal framework. Do you think the time is right to maybe just look at that again in terms of making sure flexibilities and provisions are appropriate?
So ultimately, the review, we'll inform the review by putting factual evidence into it. Ultimately, the review will be a negotiation between the two governments. I think the substantive point you're making, I think, is really well made in the context of, I think we're now seeing through this tax and social security devolution the real subtleties about how the framework operates. And even though we have tax devolution and social security devolution, the decisions that can be taken in the Scottish Parliament and the funding implications for the Scottish Parliament's budget are still heavily determined by what happens in the UK government. And a good example of that would be around the two-child limit, for example, where in the autumn the UK government's decision to abolish the two-child limit on universal credit essentially changed the spending plans or the opportunity for the Scottish Government by about £120, £150 million just in the run-up to our budget. And it's a decision taken by the UK Government has an impact here in Scotland. So I think that's just the nature of the framework. That's just the nature of the framework that's been set up. In terms of flexibilities, more flexibilities that could go in there, some of the areas that people have spoken about are are there more flexibilities that we could use to smooth spending over time? So one of the areas we've talked about with the Finance Committee in more detail is that the Scottish Government is quite constrained in its ability to shift monies from year to year in order to smooth out any lumpiness in terms of spending. So they're using, for example, or planning to use, or having a contingency to use the Scotland monies, so the one-off payments from this granting of offshore licences, in order to try and smooth day-to-day expenditure. And I guess the general point is it's not really a great idea to be using one-off monies to smooth expenditure. So there's a question in there about does the government have enough flexibilities still within limits in order to smooth the day-to-day spending and to maybe offset policy decisions that come quite late on in the day at the UK level to then manage those changes more appropriately.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I guess I'm just trying to understand what the Scottish Government can do when I feel like there is that shock to their budget, other than cut their cloth for that balanced budget, which will mean cuts elsewhere or tax raises elsewhere. There's a resource borrowing of over £600 million per annum. I think capped at about, if my notes are right, about 1.8 billion cumulative amounts. Obviously, once you borrow, if it's a recurring shortfall, then there are issues there. But can that borrowing be used to make up such shortfalls, or is that only for shortfalls in tax projections?
So it's a really good question. So essentially, the Scottish Government cannot borrow to fund day-to-day expenditures beyond essentially being able to borrow for the forecast errors we make around taxation. So that's broadly what they can do. So if, for example, the UK government announced 2 weeks before the budget that we're going to take £200 million out of a social security reform, which would lead to lower block grant funding, the Scottish Government couldn't, directly on the basis of that, say, well, we're going to borrow that money and pay it back over time and work out a new policy. That's not the way the framework works. They have to balance the budget, and they would then have to make decisions to either trim spending in another area or to try and find additional revenue to do it. The reason they do that, just to be really clear, the reason they do that is that the framework is designed at the time to talk about no better or worse off as a result of devolution. So if you choose to cut a social security spending in England, then it necessarily is the case that funding shouldn't flow through to Scotland to deliver the same payment, because that payment is now no longer being delivered in England. So that's the principle behind it, but it does put the Scottish Government in a budget management position that is quite challenging.
I appreciate that, and ironically, that would be a forecast error, not of taxation, but a forecast error in relation to anticipated block grant revenue. Forecast errors in taxation can be used for borrowing resource, but not forecast errors in terms of block grant adjustments due to in-year or year-on-year policy changes at a UK level. That's maybe something the fiscal framework could look at to smooth out those income shocks. Can I check? There's a reserve limit, I think, of around £700 million or so, maybe a bit more, the Scottish Government can, if you like, bank for a rainy day, for lack of a better expression. Does that seem like the right sum that the Scottish Government could retain in reserves for such rainy days, so to speak, or to even just to smooth out those year-on-year fluctuations? And could that be used to plug funding gaps that ahead of taking a more structured view about how you might want to address any structural deficits?
So the reserve is really interesting in that it's been something there was quite a debate about just before the last fiscal framework review, because it was essentially capped in cash terms. So as inflation kicked in, the reserve limit didn't go up. So it is now banked in and increasing with inflation. And again, this is an area where, again, the review might look at. The two things I would say about the reserve. One is, you're right, you can bank it for a rainy day, but it means you're not spending it now. And I think, the challenges in public services and pressures and funding, etc., means that, yes, you can make some savings now in the hope, to address pressures in the future, but you're not spending that money today when there's probably good causes or at least demand there. I guess the only point I'd make about the limits would be is that, again, just to give you an idea of the context, so we think that total funding next year will be 68,000 million, and you've got a reserve of 700 million. I mean, that's quite a small ratio that the government have to play with, so it's not a significant fiscal resource that they can play around with. It really is quite marginal.
Okay. Final question, Convener. It's to set in context why I was asking these questions, because our committee, or the future committee for social justice and social security, will have to get its head around future budgets and budget scrutiny, and we're just trying to work out what levers are at the Scottish Government's disposal to plan effectively in relation to social security spend going forward, the challenge that the Fiscal Commission have as well, and whether the fiscal framework can be changed in a way just to give more certainty in that planning process for the Scottish Government. Are there any final comments, Professor Roy, you'd make about the fiscal framework that a future committee of the Scottish Parliament looking at social security should absolutely be focused on going forward?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can give you some kind of personal opinion, but Justine might want to come in as well. So obviously this will be for the, as I said, negotiation in there. I mean, one thing I would think about as a committee is the fact that so much of social security is demand-led, which is so different from other aspects of public services, of day-to-day public expenditure. So your ability to control it within year, your ability to control it between years is much more limited than it is in other areas of public services. So once you set entitlement, essentially that's it. And then demand flows in, and that determines the expenditure. That's quite different from other budgets where you're allocating money to a local government or you're allocating money to a health board, and you could change that number. You could change that allocation if you wanted to. So there's a broad question about, given that demand-led element, does the Scottish Government have the fiscal levers to smooth those potential variabilities over time? And I think the second one is exactly, I think, the large, really good discussion we've had today about the exposure of the Scottish budget to policy decisions at a UK level that might happen quite late in the process, and the ability for the Scottish Government to then respond to that based upon plans. I mean, we always encourage and really push the government on multi-year spending allocations, and that's really important that these spending plans are set out. I do have sympathy that the government has to wait until the UK budget and then have to produce their own budget within a very short period of time, and there could be quite significant policy changes in that budget, and that makes it very difficult for the Scottish Government to plan their budget next year, let alone set out a plan for 3 or 4 years. So if there's anything that can be done to give greater flexibility in there, then I think that would be potentially positive for fiscal management.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think as well, it's important to consider not just the social security funding envelope, but actually the whole funding envelope, because you know, as Graham's just said, social security is largely demand-led, and, you know, as I say, it can go up, it can go down, depending on what's happening out there. But what you've also got to factor in as well is the sort of huge resource spend that goes on in the Scottish Government as well, in terms of, you know, the sort of civil servants, you know, the work, the pay bill, you know, etc., the national insurance bill, all that kind of stuff. So whilst, you know, there's only a limited amount of money and you've got to balance your budget, you've got to make sure that if you're spending a lot more money, say on social security in 1 year, that may be at the expense of another area of the Scottish budget. So it's very important for any future social security committee to have that kind of bigger picture in mind and focus on that as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. So just on what you were discussing there, I guess then, you know, for our future committee purposes, I guess then from a demand line point of view, that there must be a drift within the baseline for the forecasting, you know, in that aspect, given what you've told us today of the amount of if, buts and maybes in terms of what happens, such as policy change, inflationary rises.
Yeah, and you've got demographics as well, for example, that would come through. So that's why, even with no policy changes, we expect Social Security spending to increase over the course of the forecast horizon and to take up a more significant share of the total Scottish budget relative to where it is just now, and that is something which, again, a future future committee in Parliament would want to think about. I mean, one other thing I would say around, and it just picks up the really good question that we had from Mr. Balfour as well, is what's happening upstream. That's the bit I think is really interesting, is that a lot of our focus is very much on trying to forecast take-up of benefits, of you know, the payments that are made, etc. But I think there's some really fascinating questions, which is that once this beds in, what is driving the trends here? What is driving the flows into certain payments? And what are the outcomes of, as Justine was saying, of policies in other areas of the government? Are they making it better or worse in terms of the inflows, and how does Social Security come through? And I think that's some really fascinating questions to look at.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. So that concludes our questioning for today. So thank you, for all your help here today. And again, that concludes our public business, and we'll now move into a private session. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Thanks.